I think he's had an excellent spring, Anthony. I mean, the past 8 to 10 weeks, and really probably beyond that, really the past 6 months with, as a rookie player, and particularly at quarterback, you learn a lot your first year, and especially if you don't start a full season, start 6 to 7, or I guess you start 7 games, and you kind of go through the year. It's adjustment going to the NFL, and then you get a chance to catch your breath and say, okay, well, here are the things I need to work on, here are the things I need to learn. And I think he did a phenomenal job this offseason. That really started in January and February, and then certainly as we got into having real practices in May, his growth has been tremendous. So we're all very excited to see Shedeur's fall camp, preseason.
The Cleveland Browns already know who their starting quarterback is. They've known for weeks, and everything Andrew Berry said on that radio interview, every careful word, every diplomatic pause, was designed to make sure you didn't figure it out yet. Here's the strange part. The quarterback they're protecting right now isn't Deshaun. The one getting the careful language, the hedged compliments, the everything's on the table non-answers. That's Deshaun. Shedeur Sanders is getting something else entirely. He's getting adjectives, words like phenomenal, words like tremendous, words that in GM speak don't get used accidentally. Not when you've been doing this for 6 years and you understand exactly how everything you say gets parsed. By the time this video ends, you're going to hear that interview the way I heard it, not as a media obligation, not as a PR move, as a message.
But I wouldn't rule out anything. We're looking for guys who can perform and who can lead.
Now, we have a really unique situation with Deshaun, just given everything we know about him and everything that he has worked through to try to get back on the field. And then the owner had the swing and the miss comments. Does that sometimes make it a little tougher on the coach or maybe you when an owner says something like that publicly? I imagine you're having those conversations behind the scenes as well.
Not necessarily. I mean, I think you deal with what you have. You deal with how players progress or don't progress. But honestly, the public discourse, doesn't really have a factor in terms of how we think about either putting together the team.
Think about what this franchise has been carrying. Not in the abstract, in the specific. Picture the third quarter of the 2023 season when Cleveland, a team that mortgaged 3 years of draft capital, paid $230 million guaranteed to a quarterback coming off an 11-game suspension, realized in real time that the investment wasn't working, that Deshaun Watson wasn't the same player who left Houston. The organization absorbed that quietly. The fans absorbed it loudly. And what nobody talks about is what that kind of wound does to a front office's psychology when you've made a mistake that large, one that is public, documented, and impossible to undo. You don't just move on. You don't wake up the next morning with fresh eyes. You carry the posture of that decision into every room you walk into. Andrew Berry has been carrying it. Every press conference, every draft table, every time someone asks him about the quarterback position, which is every single day. And here's the thing about wounds that haven't healed. They change how you speak. They change what you reach for. They change which words feel safe and which ones feel like liability. Last week, Andrew Berry stopped reaching for safe words, at least when the subject was Shedeur Sanders.
All right, well, one of the quarterbacks, Shedeur Sanders, has gone from the 5th rounder to 4th string to now a legitimate chance to compete for a starting job. So what can you say about his trajectory and his rise through the program?
I think he's had an excellent spring, Anthony. I mean, the past 8 to 10 weeks, and really probably beyond that, really the past 6 months with, as a rookie player, and particularly at quarterback, you learn a lot your first year, and especially if you don't start a full season, start 6 to 7, or I guess you start 7 games, and you kind of go through the year. It's adjustment going to the NFL, and then you get a chance to catch your breath and say, okay, well, here are the things I need to work on, here are the things I need to learn. And I think he did a phenomenal job this offseason. That really started in January and February, and then certainly as we got into having real practices in May, his growth has been tremendous. So we're all very excited to see Shedeur's fall camp, preseason, things of that nature when we get into padded situations, live situations, less scripted. But his growth has truly been phenomenal.
Berry said Shedeur has had an excellent spring.
That's not a compliment, that's a qualifier. But then he kept going. He said Shedeur's growth has been tremendous. He said the front office is all very excited to see him in padded situations, in live situations, when things are less scripted. Less scripted. That phrase is doing more work than it looks like. Because what he's saying, if you've spent any time watching how general managers talk, is that Shedeur performs when the structure comes off, when it's real, when the play call doesn't protect you. That's not something you say about a project quarterback. Barry was asked directly, how do you evaluate this quarterback competition? And he gave an answer that most people heard as a deflection. He said spring is an install and developmental period. He said you take a developmental mindset. He said every day isn't necessarily an A, B, or C grade. But pay attention to the sequence. He said all of that and then immediately went back to Shedeur. On his own. Nobody prompted it. You don't pivot to the player you're trying to protect. You pivot to the one you believe in. Andrew Barry chose to go on 92 The Fan. Think about that for 1 second. This is a GM who understands leverage, who understands access, who understands that every media appearance is a choice about timing, audience, and message. Why do a media run right now, before training camp, before padded practices, before anyone has actually played a meaningful down? Because you need to manage perception without making an announcement. Shedeur Sanders was drafted in the 5th round and started 7 games as a rookie. He went from 4th on the depth chart to legitimate starter competition. That trajectory in 11 months is not normal. Organizations don't invest that kind of attention, coaching hours, scheme adjustment, the kind of spring the Browns gave him, in someone they're planning to sit. When was the last time you heard a GM use the word phenomenal to describe someone he wasn't already committed to?
Abel, I think it would be silly to go into a season and say, hey, something absolutely can or cannot happen. And I think particularly at the quarterback position, right? Like we've seen it with guys, whether it's Sam Darnold or Daniel Jones or Geno Smith or even Baker after he left us in Carolina. And so I think you have to be open-minded and flexible. I wouldn't rule out anything. We're looking for guys who can perform and who can lead.
Now, we have a really unique situation with Deshaun, just given everything we know about him and everything that he is.
Here's what nobody's talking about. This isn't just a quarterback competition. This is an identity crisis playing out in slow motion for an entire franchise. And the psychological framework that unlocks it is something called identity threat. The phenomenon that occurs when a person's self-concept becomes entangled with an outcome they can no longer control. Deshaun Watson's entire narrative, the comeback story, the resilience arc, the he worked through everything framing that Barry himself used in that interview, requires him to win this competition. Not just to play well, to win it. Because losing it means the story ends differently than he needs it to. And here's what identity threat does to a player's body before his mind processes it. It makes him louder in the wrong moments, or quieter in the wrong moments. It changes how he reads pressure. It changes what his pressure signature looks like on the field. Barry gave us a window into how the organization is reading Watson right now. He said, and I'm going to be very precise here, we have a really unique situation with Deshaun, just given everything we know about him and everything that he has worked through. He didn't say Watson looks sharp. He didn't say Watson is competing well. He said Watson has worked through things. That's past tense language being used to describe a present tense competition. Now, flip it. Look at the language around Shedeur. His growth has been tremendous, present, active, progressive. The organization isn't narrating Watson's performance, they're narrating his resilience. Those are 2 completely different stories. But to understand why this matters, we have to go back to January. Barry said Shedeur's transformation really started in January and February, before OTAs, before any spring installation, before they even had a coaching staff fully in place. That means while the NFL world was debating who Cleveland would draft, who they'd sign, how they'd rebuild, Shedeur Sanders was already in a room somewhere working on the things he needed to fix. That's not a project player's offseason. That's a starter's offseason.
Yeah, I think that that's certainly like a consideration when you build out the team, and specifically with as much work as we did on the offense this spring. There's more than one way to have successful offensive football. And certainly Todd and Kevin, they have a lot of commonalities, but they also have their major differences in that regard. I think the other element that makes it a bit unique is the fact that we really did a lot of work with the offensive infrastructure, not just with the offensive scheme or a new coaching staff, but the players that surround the quarterback position as well. And I think that makes
Organizations speak in code. They always have. You just have to know the dialect. When Barry was asked about Watson's contract extension, about whether there's a world where Watson is their long-term quarterback, he said, "Everything's on the table. I wouldn't rule anything out." Translation, we're not extending him. You don't say, "I wouldn't rule anything out" about a franchise cornerstone. You say that about a tryout, about someone who has an opportunity, about someone for whom the ceiling and the floor are both genuinely in play. Compare that to how he talked about the new head coach's offensive philosophy, how they really did a lot of work on the infrastructure, not just with the scheme, but with the players around the quarterback position. The players around the quarterback position. He built an offense around a quarterback. He just hasn't said which one out loud. When he talked about Deshaun possibly winning the competition and playing well, he said it would be silly to go into a season and say something absolutely can or cannot happen. That is a man protecting his exit options publicly. That's not commitment behavior. That is hedge behavior. And the contrast between that language and phenomenal and tremendous and all very excited, that contrast is the story. Think about this from Shedeur Sanders' perspective for a second. You came into the league as a fifth-round pick when you were supposed to be a first-rounder. The draft analysts questioned your arm, your mechanics, whether you could translate your father's system to the NFL. You spent your rookie year watching, learning, starting 7 games in a situation that would have broken most young quarterbacks, on a team rebuilding, behind a shaky line, in a market that had already emotionally moved on from your predecessor. And then you spent January and February alone, doing the work. And now the GM of your NFL franchise is going on a radio tour using the word phenomenal to describe your spring. What does that feel like? What does that make you believe about what's coming? There are 52 other men in that building watching this, and they're not reading press releases. They're reading reps. They're reading who gets the ball with the first unit. They're reading which quarterback the coaching staff treats differently when the camera crews leave. The locker room already knows, and they always know before the announcement. The question is whether the locker room has decided, whether it has chosen its quarterback in the quiet way that teams always choose, in the way that makes the official depth chart feel like paperwork rather than revelation. If this resolves the way the evidence suggests, if Shedeur Sanders wins this competition in training camp and carries it into the regular season, the Cleveland Browns become one of the more interesting stories in the AFC. Not because they become Super Bowl contenders immediately, but because the league will be watching a fifth-round rookie quarterback on a team with legitimate defensive upside try to prove that the entire evaluation apparatus got his draft position wrong. That's a compelling football story, and Andrew Barry knows it, which is why he's managing this narrative so carefully before it becomes impossible to manage. In 3 years, we will look back at this spring as the moment the Cleveland Browns either found their quarterback for the next decade or proved, once again, that the franchise's gravitational pull toward chaos is stronger than any individual talent inside it. That's not hyperbole, that's the actual stakes. Because if Shedeur Sanders is who this spring suggests he might be, then the Browns accidentally stumbled into the best outcome possible from the worst salary cap decision in recent NFL history. And if he's not, if Watson somehow wins this thing and struggles again, then we're right back here in a year having this exact conversation about the 2027 draft. Andrew Berry knows that too. At the start of this, I told you the Browns already know who their quarterback is. You've now heard what I heard. Phenomenal, tremendous, all very excited, active language, present tense, progressive tense, versus worked through things. Everything's on the table. I wouldn't rule anything out. That's not a competition, that's a confirmation dressed in media-friendly ambiguity. Because underneath all of this, past the depth charts and the radio interviews, and the careful language of a GM who has learned exactly what every word costs, there's a kid who came into the NFL as an afterthought, who spent a year watching, who spent an offseason working in a gym somewhere while the world debated whether he was worth the pick, and now the people in the building are using words like phenomenal when they talk about him. Not because they have to, because those are the words that came out. So here's what I want you to sit with. Is Andrew Berry, a GM who finally found his quarterback at the bottom of the draft and is now carefully navigating the most expensive roster situation in the league to give that player a real shot? Or is this just another Cleveland Browns spring where everything looks different before the pads go on and history finds a way to repeat itself regardless? Drop it below. I'll be reading every single one.